Today's stories are about real people who try to control fate, and what they end up doing is just causing historic levels of destruction. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to reorganize the like button's pantry for them. But instead of actually doing that, just remove all the labels from their canned goods. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of June 26, 1826, 38-year-old Samuel Willie Jr. stepped out of his house in a remote area of New Hampshire's White Mountain Range called the Notch. His wife, Polly, was at his side, and together they looked around in shock because the land surrounding their home was almost completely destroyed. There had been a huge storm the previous night, and so Sam and Polly had been expecting some damage. But what they were seeing now was far worse than they had imagined. The heavy rain had caused the river in front of their home to completely overflow, so half of their property was now completely submerged in water. The deluge had also triggered a rock slide from one side of the mountain slopes behind them, so there were also rocks and mud and entire trees that were now kind of littering their yard and adjacent fields. Sam saw, luckily, the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock, but only barely. And there was damage to those structures from the storm itself that he would have to repair. So Sam began calculating how much time and money it was going to take to clean all this up. And next to him, he heard Polly kind of mumble to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam sighed because he knew that Polly was referring to their decision to move to the Notch in the first place. And right now, staring at all this awful destruction right in front of him, he had to agree with her. This might have been a terrible idea. So up until about a year ago, Sam and Polly and their 5 kids had lived on a farm about 20 miles away from where they were right now, and it had been a very quiet, cozy life. But Sam had always had this feeling that he wanted to do something more exciting than just be a regular old farmer. And with this house in the Notch, he'd seen an opportunity for adventure, and also an opportunity to make some money. So in this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a 12-mile-long road that cut through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch house was right in the middle of that road. But since this was the year 1826, this road was more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous and rocky, and neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through. So as a result, travelers were typically on foot. And there was literally nowhere to stop on this whole 12-mile road except for the Willie's Notch house. So Sam had realized how valuable this Notch house could be if he converted it into an inn. But he also had bigger aspirations for the place, like beyond it just being a pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a destination. After all, the White Mountains were incredibly beautiful, and where the Willies lived in the Notch was no exception. Their house was right on a riverbank in a mountain valley, surrounded on all sides by the woods and towering mist-covered peaks. It was all honestly breathtaking. And as soon as Sam had seen it, he knew that it could be a famous destination for poets and authors and artists because it was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. I mean, it was perfect. But so far, his dream, of coming out here to the Notch house had been a lot of work. The house was large, but really old, and it had been abandoned for a while before he and his family got there, so it was in really bad shape and quite dilapidated. Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up, and they'd already done some work to expand the house and the barn to accommodate more travelers, but Sam knew he still had a lot to do before the Notch house became some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to fix, which he also had to admit was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly looked around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew, really, he was lucky that their house was even still standing, and that he and his family were even still alive. I mean, that storm was catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they'd come to death, his heart began to race. I mean, he wondered if if Polly was right, and they should really at this point just pack the family up and go back to simple farming because it was safer. But leaving meant sort of admitting failure. His big dream would be over. There would be no artist's retreat, no tourist mecca. He would not be some creative benefactor. He'd just be a farmer. So he took a deep breath, and then he asked his wife to please give this place one more chance. He promised he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but also make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain threw at them. And Polly hesitated, but ultimately she believed in her husband, and she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers worked practically around the clock repairing the damage from the storm. They fixed up windows and shingles and cleared away all the debris, which took forever. And then once all the repairs were done, Sam continued working, but now he focused on improving the property. As the weeks passed by, he worked very hard to build his family a very secure home so they'd be much safer against future storms. He reinforced walls and built a whole new roof and mapped out disaster scenarios so that he and his family would always be prepared. One disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was right behind their house. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just topple onto them and crush them. And he and his workers soon realized that they couldn't actually move the boulder. It was just way too big. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be dangerous. And while Sam did all this work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place was proof that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Sam Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain pummeled the glass, and Sam could hear powerful wind battering the sides of the house. It was pitch black out, but every now and then there was a burst of lightning that would light the whole valley up for a few seconds before it went dark again. Each time this happened, a crash of thunder would follow that was so loud it shook the house down to its foundation. Behind Sam, Polly, along with their 5 kids and the 2 men that were working on the property, were all sitting at the kitchen table. And Polly and the kids in particular were very scared, and the whole group were reading Bible verses, in these kind of frantic hushed tones, like they were trying to, will the storm to be over and to cling on to their faith, to pray that they'd be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her, because this was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger than that one that completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed. And each time there was a burst of lightning, Sam could see the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam was admittedly quite scared himself. He tried to keep that in, but his heart was racing and he was really anxious. But he told himself that this was the moment he'd prepared for all summer long. This was it. He had done so much work to make sure this was a safe place during storms. And he felt like they'd be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his kids were making it really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really okay here. So for a little while, Sam just kept looking out the window, listening to his family behind him. But then eventually he turned around, and as calm as he could, he told them all to go to bed. It was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, nodded and got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. It was very loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. There was going to be damage tomorrow, but Sam was thinking that, maybe we're going to get through this thing. But a little after midnight, Sam heard this sudden, extremely loud banging sound outside, and he froze because he knew it was not thunder. It sounded more like an explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn must have collapsed. And thinking that this storm had just taken out an entire building that he had reinforced for a storm, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screams for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up, that it's not safe, get away from the windows, we have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, everyone's frantically scrambling around, trying to find a safe spot, but they don't know where it is. But as they're sort of navigating, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang, and then there were screams all around him, and then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that road in the direction of the Notch house where the Willies lived. So John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a business trip. And he had made this trip many times before. He knew the road, but the road currently was flooded and there was rock slides and damage everywhere, so it was quite slow going and pretty miserable. But he knew at the halfway point was this house, the Notch house, where Sam Willie and his family lived, and they were looking to convert their house into an inn for travelers, and even though it wasn't fully established yet, John knew he could very likely get into that house, have a hot meal, rest a little bit before he made the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze because the area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also been clearly a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, and the field in front of the Willies was completely buried in rocks and mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place, not even a window. Relieved and a little amazed, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked. But no one answered. So eventually he just opened the door and poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply and nobody moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor and beds, and sheets had been yanked around and were messy, and the Bible was wide open on the kitchen table. John stood in the middle of the home trying to work out what could have happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but had left in a hurry. So John guessed they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, either at a neighbor's or the tavern, miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to allow him to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of still sleeping in the home without them here. But he really had nowhere else to go. And it was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone during the dark. So even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately woke up and rushed over to a window. But he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was almost completely dark outside. He waited to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound and turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe the sound was one of the Willies and that they hadn't actually left the property, but were maybe outside, injured or in trouble because of this storm. So John sprinted outside, but again, it was pitch black outside and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting out, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning answered him. But the moaning kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint where it was actually coming from, other than it clearly being outside somewhere. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark, and he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house, and for hours he just sat in bed and listened to the moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right outside to look around. And this time, he quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willies' oxen, moaning in pain from being trapped under some debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the wooden planks and rocks off the ox, And after he had freed the animal, it amazingly staggered to its feet and hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness, even though the sound had been from an ox and he had saved it. He just felt like there was something wrong here, and so he decided that he had to go and see the willies with his own eyes, just to make sure they really were okay. So even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was exhausted, he was drenched, from this awful journey he had just taken again on this road. But more than that, he was really worried about the willies, because as he made that trip down the road, he saw neighbors' homes along the way and kind of expected to see the willies in one of them. But no, the willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes, and in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all basically in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern because of the storm. But when John looked around the tavern, he could tell the willies were not in there either. And this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet, as its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had, but eventually everyone just shook their head and said, no, we don't know where they are. And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property, and so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this part of the world. And there were not a lot of people doing that. This was a very small community, and so they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so this was no exception. But as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the willies' property and find these people, it took so long to navigate the road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see, the home really was just as John described. It was sort of a mess, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer, and because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next storm. And it seemed like all his preparations and reinforcements on his land had paid off, because here his house was standing tall. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why did the willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the house, he saw that the willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table wide open, and when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but, kind of shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the property for signs of the willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside to find the willies, or at least to find a clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still there had been nothing found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point, the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange buzzing sound, and so he followed it, and eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. So the thing that Sam Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move said boulder or otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second shelter that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willys' disappearance, well, during that storm, Sam's screaming for his family to, take cover, get away from the windows. He's heard this crashing sound outside that he is convinced is the sound of his barn collapsing, and, his house is next. He's yelling for them to take cover. Well, the family listened to him, and together they did seek cover. They left the main house and went into that second shelter that they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic mistake because that humongous boulder right behind the house was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was like a protective barrier. When there was an actual rock slide during this horrible storm, well, the rubble actually piled up on the backside of that boulder and did not strike the house at all. And so in essence, this boulder basically made the Willys' original home the single safest place to be on the whole property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they were overtaken by the rock slide and killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand reached out from underneath the rubble. Ultimately, because of this tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willys had hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what happened, and before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy, and some even wrote books about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he hoped. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. So Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by reading their palms or using crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she typically was right, which was why, out of the 400-something fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like royalty and wives of very high-up government members and other very wealthy people of high society. And it was a big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people, because she did not come for money. Actually, there was a time where she almost had to live out on the streets, because years ago, when her husband died, she was left alone with her 3 kids and really no way to provide for them. But she'd worked very hard and actually ended up thriving. Her kids had grown up, and she turned her fortune-telling talents into a real business. She'd been so successful that she really was maybe about 3 clients away from being able to retire. And Marie was not one to just sit back and let those clients magically find her. She was a self-made woman and knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so that's why she was at this party now. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene, and so many of the guests at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to try to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to the audience was that Marie was very drunk. So Marie was loud and talkative in general, and that extroverted attitude really helped her get clients typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll, because her stories were drawing gasps and laughs, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed bothered by what Marie was saying. the hostess of the party. The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was silently trying to tell her to shut up. But Marie figured she knew why she was acting that way. I mean, the hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie's getting all this attention and potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. Like, she just got to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding, and her stomach was in knots. I mean, she was severely hungover from drinking the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened the night before, but she did remember telling a lot of stories. And she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the whole time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if she'd said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if, the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that, somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, her career, from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening, until that night when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous and kept fidgeting and smoothing her hair, and she told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party and was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension she'd been holding up over the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment, despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time. That clearly, here she is getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this woman, and maybe there were more, like it had been a success. So very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars and crystals and bottles of potions and decks of cards to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room, and once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told because she had a terribly abusive husband, and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie. She'd seen a lot of nervous, frail women like this one who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women that were in this position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really what these women were looking for was control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she grabbed this woman's hand and she turned it around and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading her palm. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. And Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely, and then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because, after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete shock. She had no idea what they were doing there, but they immediately just grabbed her and said she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and she had friends in high places like Parliament and noble circles. They could vouch for her and say that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her and without reacting to what she was saying, They just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at this, her heart sank and she stopped struggling, because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the whole city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded high-ranking officials in parliament surrender their wives to authorities, throwing the Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. They left the city and began forcing the French nobility out of their castles to go face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last, until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's favorite mistress. By the time the police finished their investigation, hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing charges or sitting in jail cells. And screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country, and then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So Marie Bosse was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had poisoned someone or been poisoned by someone. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used like a solution for many kinds of problems, like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and poison them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden. Because remember, they can't get divorced. So if you're stuck with somebody and you don't like them, well, just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best kept secret, until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie told stories of poisoning people, and people thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these stories. And so he wondered if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and the hostess is kind of trying to signal her to stop talking about it, but Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police, and the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, read her palm and read her future, but then also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband, poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years, and during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners to royalty. 23 of those people were banished, and 34 people were executed. including Marie Boss. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the morning of December 10th, 1995, a seasoned homicide detective walked into a house on a quiet street in the suburbs of Tucson, Arizona. Another officer led him down the hallway to a bedroom, and when the detective looked inside, he froze. Now, he'd seen a lot of crime scenes before, but this one had to be one of the worst. I mean, there was blood everywhere, all over the walls, all over the floors, the mattress. I mean, it was just a complete nightmare. But as much as it appeared like clearly he's looking at the scene of a murder, there was a problem. There was no body. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please hide mousetraps in all of the like button shoes. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of December 8th, 1995, a 41-year-old mother named Bonnie Sanborn set a box of cereal down on the dining room table inside of her home in Tucson, Arizona. She then called for her 3 kids to come eat breakfast, and just a few seconds later, her youngest son, 10-year-old Brandon, came bombing into the room and sat down at the table. Bonnie then poured herself a cup of coffee and carried it down the hallway to her 13-year-old daughter Candace's room. Candace was busy putting on makeup, and when Bonnie reminded her that it was almost time to leave for school, she just rolled her eyes and said, she'd be out in a minute. Then Bonnie continued going down the hallway and knocked on the door of her 15-year-old son Bradley's room. And when he didn't open the door, she shouted through the door that if he didn't get out of bed soon, she would come in there and literally drag him out. But there was still no response after she did this, so Bonnie put her ear to the door and listened for movement. She was hoping to hear sheets rustling or dresser drawers opening, but she didn't hear those sounds. Instead, she heard a different sound. It was like this weird clanking sound, like metal pounding against metal. And so because this noise was so unusual, she just opened up the door, and she found her son, Bradley, along with his friend, 18-year-old Jason Horbachevsky, squatting in the middle of the room, trying to pry open this big metal box with a crowbar and a hammer. Bonnie stepped fully inside the room to get a better look, and she saw there was a phone receiver dangling off the side of this metal box. It was clearly a payphone that Bradley and Jason had clearly stolen from somewhere out on the street, and now they were trying to, steal the quarters out from inside of it. Bonnie was so shocked that all she could think to do was just say, "What are you doing?" And Bradley, he looked at his mom and just seemed totally unfazed that she was in there, and he just said, "What? We're just trying to get the change out of this payphone." And then before she could react to that, Jason, so her son's friend, he looked over his shoulder at her also very nonchalantly and just began laughing in a way that made Bonnie wonder if he was high on something. At this point, Bonnie just stepped back into the hallway and just tried to think through what she should even do here. I mean, this is so obvious that they're committing a crime in her house right now. Like, what in the world? But at the same time, she'd been having problems with her son Bradley for a long time now. This was definitely not the first time she had caught her son, doing something bad. Her son had been known to throw parties in their house that he definitely was not supposed to. He would pick fights with basically everybody in the house, all the family members. And on top of that, she also knew that periodically he would hang out with known gang members. Now, for a while, Bonnie had tried to be understanding and supportive because she remembered how hard it was to be a teenager herself. But her son's trouble really just kept escalating. And this payphone thing was like a breaking point. She knew she could not let something like this slide. I mean, it was literally criminal, and so obviously so. And if she didn't step in now, it was clear her son would just continue to push the limits further and further until he got hurt or got somebody else hurt or, wound up in jail or something. Like, this was the moment she had to put her foot down. And so, without saying another word to her son or Jason, who were now back to banging on this metal box, she just turned and walked back into the kitchen where her other kids, Brandon and Candace, were now eating their breakfast and looking annoyed by all the chaos being caused by their older brother. And she walked right past them, picked up the phone, and she called 911. And when the dispatcher picked up her call, Bonnie said she wanted to report a theft, and she gave the dispatcher her own address. And then after she hung up, she told Candace and Brandon to go get their backpacks and go outside so they didn't miss the bus. A few minutes later, Bonnie heard a knock on the front door, and she opened it up to find two sheriff's deputies standing on the doorstep. She actually recognized the deputies, and she knew they also recognized her, because this was not the first time they'd been called to the Sanborn house. They'd been there several times actually recently to deal with domestic issues largely caused by her son. But Bonnie knew, Bradley, even though he was the obvious main problem, at least in terms of her current issues, she was already seeing that her 13-year-old child, Candace, had begun acting out a lot lately. And she was also worried what would happen when her 10-year-old, Brandon, became a teenager himself. Like, would he begin, following the footsteps of his brother and maybe his older sister as well? She didn't know, but she just couldn't understand why her kids just were misbehaving so much. Like, what did she do wrong? And so Bonnie showed the deputies to Bradley's room, where he and Jason were still actively trying to pry open this payphone. And when Bradley looked up and saw the police, he looked furious. He screamed at his mother that he couldn't believe she'd called the cops on him. But Bonnie, she did her best to push down the natural bit of guilt she was feeling, because she didn't want to have to call the cops on her son. The deputies ultimately handcuffed both Bradley and Jason, and they walked them outside, and Bonnie trailed right behind them. And then as the police were putting the kids in the back of the squad car, Bonnie pulled one of the deputies aside and asked if he could make sure Bradley spent at least one night in the juvenile detention center. She knew this was a very tough love sort of approach. Basically demanding your kid stays effectively in jail overnight. But she was also hoping that in addition to being maybe scared straight here, he would also get counseling in the juvenile detention center and maybe begin to see the value of staying out of trouble. The deputy nodded and said he'd see what he could do. As the squad car drove away, Bonnie saw movement in a window of the house across the street. She squinted and saw that one of her neighbors was peering out the curtains to get a look at all the commotion. And then further down the street, a couple out for a morning jog had slowed down and was just staring at the squad car as they passed by. And now for Bonnie, she wasn't that surprised. She'd be looking out the window too if police showed up on her street. But at the same time, it still made her very embarrassed. She knew people in this neighborhood were already very aware of her family's problems, and it was a lot to bear. And frankly, making it even worse was the fact that, generally speaking, Bonnie's neighbors were nice to her in person when they were face to face with her. People even went out of their way to help her, but she knew behind her back, people in this neighborhood gossiped constantly about her family. Now, for Bonnie, this was obviously humiliating and also very frustrating because how could she possibly stop gossip? She couldn't. But more than just disliking the fact that there were all these people talking about her, she also just felt very isolated right now. She was married, but her husband Robert had gotten a job in Maryland, and he only came home every other weekend. Bonnie had actually tried to sell the house in Tucson and move the whole family to Maryland, but she'd eventually decided it just wasn't really worth the trouble. Plus, Robert had already talked to his supervisor about potentially transferring back to Tucson, and he was supposed to be coming back for good just next week. And so at this point, Bonnie was just trying to survive here. She still felt very isolated, but she knew, Robert, he'd be back soon, and she wouldn't be alone anymore, and she would get to deal with the kids, with the nosy neighbors, with the police, with her partner. It just felt like that would be a whole lot better. About 16 hours later, around 11:45 p.m. that night, Bonnie brushed her teeth and put on her PJs. The house was quiet for once, except for the TV humming in the living room. She'd gotten a call from the juvenile detention center that afternoon, and Bradley was being held there on theft charges, which Bonnie thought was for the best. But his friend Jason was 18 years old, so he was not held. Instead, he was just given a ticket and released the same day. And Bonnie knew that as soon as Bradley was out again, He and Jason would reconnect right away and just fall right back into their same old antics. Before she went to bed, Bonnie went to the living room where her other two kids, Candace and Brandon, were on the couch watching TV. And she told them it was time for bed, time to turn off the TV and go to your rooms, but they just ignored her and just continued to watch TV. It was a Friday night, and the two kids didn't have anywhere to be in the morning, and Bonnie had just done enough fighting for the day. So she just decided, you know what? Let them stay up. They can go to bed when they want to. And so she told the kids to, don't stay up too late and go to bed soon. Then she left, leaving them on the couch. She went to her own bedroom and she turned out her lights. A few hours later, Bonnie woke up and looked over at the clock and saw it was near 3 a.m. And she also could still hear the TV on out in the living room. And so Bonnie cracked open her door and yelled down the hallway to the kids to turn off the TV and go to bed. And then as Bonnie got back in her bed, she heard the sound of the TV turning off and she heard footsteps walking down the hallway, and then the house was quiet. And she drifted back to sleep. But sometime before dawn, when it was still dark out, she woke up again. And when she rolled over in her bed, she opened her eyes and she saw there was a large figure standing over her bed. Later that same morning, around 10:45 a.m., 10-year-old Brandon woke up to a eerily silent house. Normally, his mother would have already been awake, making breakfast or getting started on chores. But when he went out in the hallway, he didn't hear her. He went into the kitchen and he checked to see if she was there, but she wasn't. And there were no dirty pans or plates in the sink and no coffee in the pot. It looked like his mom hadn't even woke up yet, which was weird for a Saturday morning. So he went to ask his older sister, Candace, if she knew where their mom was. But Candace said she hadn't seen her. So Brandon and Candace both went down the hallway to their mother's bedroom. They knocked on the door, and when she didn't answer, Brandon pushed the door open and looked inside. And what he saw made him gasp in horror. The bedroom was covered in blood, but the bedroom was also empty. His mom wasn't in there. Let me tell you about my newfound favorite treat. The other day, I had some family and friends over, and I couldn't wait to introduce them to my mochi. We all shared the mango, the strawberry, and cookies and cream, and unsurprisingly, everybody loved it. We even made a quick run to the supermarket afterwards to get more. Because sometimes the most simple pleasures in life bring the most joy, like the joyfully chill sensation of biting into refreshing, creamy, chewy My Mochi ice cream. My Mochi ice cream is like this sweet ice cream dumpling. Creamy, premium ice cream wrapped in very satisfying, sweet, chewy dough that is both refreshing and indulgent. It comes in delicious flavors like strawberry, cookies and cream, and mango. My Mochi is only around 70 calories per piece, and it's easy to share because each box comes with 6 individual mochis. If you haven't tried My Mochi, you really don't want to miss out on this joyfully chill experience. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. Later that same morning, Detective Brad Faust pulled up outside of a house in the suburbs of Tucson. He was there to investigate a mother's apparent kidnapping from her own home. Faust was actually feeling a bit frustrated to be called out to yet another case like this when he was already juggling so many others. 1995 had proven to be the deadliest year in Tucson's history. There had already been nearly 100 murders just that year, and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was swamped. But as far as anyone knew at this point, this was not a murder, it was a kidnapping. All Faust had been told was that Bonnie Sanborn was missing, and her kids had called 911 after seeing that and also seeing all the blood in her bedroom. So Faust was holding out hope here that this was actually nothing that serious, and that they would find Bonnie relatively quickly and she'd be okay. He got out of his car and he saw that officers had already taped off the house. There was a young boy and girl sitting out on the front curb, looking terrified and visibly distraught. And Faust also noticed that there was blood on both of their shirts, and so he figured that they must be Bonnie's kids, the ones who had made the 911 call, and he made a mental note that he would need to talk to them later. Then he walked through the front yard and went into the house. And right away, a crime scene photographer greeted him and then led him down the hallway. As he walked, Faust caught a glimpse of a family photo on the wall, which showed Bonnie and her husband and their 3 kids, all smiling and looking like the perfect all-American family. Before opening the door to Bonnie's bedroom, the photographer paused and warned the detective that there really was a lot of blood in here. Faust nodded, and then the photographer opened the door, and Faust immediately saw what he was talking about. I mean, there was blood spattered all over the walls, the floor, the windows, and the mattress. He felt his heart sink as he realized that with this much blood loss, they probably would not be finding their victim alive here. But he knew it was going to be very hard to figure out what had happened here or who was responsible until they found her, dead or alive. And so Faust stepped into the room closer to the bed, where a forensic technician was swabbing for fingerprints. The mattress was completely soaked in blood, and on one of the pillows, he could clearly see a bloody handprint. He figured it either belonged to Bonnie or her kidnapper, but they'd have to wait for test results to be sure. Faust stepped back, and he noticed that the sheets had been partially pulled off the bed and were sort of balled up on the middle of the mattress. And to him, it seemed like, given how much blood is in here and the fact that obviously Bonnie is not here, that clearly some sort of long and violent struggle took place in this room. And it seemed to him like the struggle must have originated on the bed, and maybe even the bulk of the struggle was happening on the bed. I mean, it's soaked in blood and the sheets are all messed up. And he's thinking, very likely then Bonnie was in bed when the attack began. Faust also noticed there was a folding knife with a red handle on the mattress, and there was also a purse that had been poured out. There were multiple credit cards and a checkbook that were just sitting on the bed, and the fact that these items were not stolen made Faust think that robbery probably was not part of the motive for whatever happened to Bonnie. But then, something on the floor by the bed caught Faust's eye. After double-checking that the room had already been photographed, Faust put on a pair of gloves and then crouched down and he picked it up. And what it was a small brown button. He carried it over to the closet and dug through Bonnie's clothes that were in there, and the button didn't seem to match anything that she owned. And so based on where it was found in the room, Faust thought, this button must have come off of somebody's clothes in the middle of this attack. It obviously could belong to Bonnie. It could have come off of what she was wearing and maybe is still wearing. Or this button could have come off of the attacker's clothes. And so Faust gave the button to a forensics officer and told him to bag it up. Then he kept looking around. And in the midst of all the blood that had been sprayed all over the room, he noticed there was a clear trail of red droplets that snaked across the carpet. The trail led to a sliding glass door that led into the backyard. And when he tried to open it, he realized it was already unlocked. The forensics officer told him that nobody had touched that door all morning, so it must have been unlocked before anybody arrived. Faust slid the door open and stepped out into the backyard, and he followed the trail of blood across the grass all the way to a door that led into the garage. He noticed there were no drag marks in the grass, so Bonnie's attacker must have been carrying her, which sort of naturally suggested that whoever did this likely was bigger and stronger than Bonnie. But also, judging from the photos he'd seen on the walls, Bonnie was very petite, so really that didn't narrow it down very much. A lot of people could potentially lift Bonnie and carry her. Faust reached the door that led into the garage, and he turned the knob, and it was unlocked. He opened it up, and when he looked inside, there wasn't a car in there. But the trail of blood clearly went into the garage at least a few feet before it disappeared, so it seemed like the suspect had literally carried Bonnie in here, loaded her into the car that likely was in here and now was not, and they drove it away, carrying Bonnie with them. And so Faust knew his best shot at finding Bonnie was to, 1, identify the car that would normally be in this garage, and then once you have the identity of the car, to go find it. Once Faust had done his initial sweep of the house, he went outside and he crouched down next to Bonnie's 2 younger kids, Candace and Brandon. And both kids were still very shaken up and totally confused. And so Faust, very gently, asked them about the last time they had seen their mother. And Candace said it was around maybe 11:45 the night before when their mom had gone to bed. But she also added that maybe around 3 a.m., she and her brother Brandon were still up watching TV in the living room, and their mom had shouted from her bedroom for them to turn off the TV and go to bed. She said that when their mom did that, they did get up, they turned off the TV, and they went to their own bedrooms and went to sleep. And both kids said they didn't hear or see anything until they woke up later that morning and found what they found in their mother's bedroom. And so this gave Faust something to work with, because it meant, if what the kids were saying was true, that Bonnie must have disappeared sometime after 3 a.m., because that's when she yelled to her kids at 3. Plus, if the suspect came in through that back sliding door that went right into Bonnie's room, and they were able to do so without waking up the kids, And then after the attack, being able to find very likely Bonnie's car keys, because that's the assumption, they found her keys and then loaded Bonnie into the car and drove off, again without waking anybody in the house. It's suggested that whoever did this, they likely were relatively familiar with the layout of the house and had probably been there before. So maybe this is somebody that they all knew. Faust pointed to the blood that was on Candace and Brandon's shirts, and he asked them where it came from. And Candace would admit that before she called 911, she and her brother had desperately gone looking for their mom in the room, in this horrible bloody bedroom, but they couldn't find her, and in their efforts to find her, they had gotten blood on themselves. Now, of course, Faust understood that these kids had been through this horribly traumatic thing, and they were just looking for their mom, but he also now knew that very likely their crime scene was contaminated now because the kids went in there and touched a bunch of stuff. But of course, he did not tell the kids that he was in any way annoyed with them or that they had done anything wrong. Instead, he just told the kids to go inside and change their clothes and then give the clothes that had blood on them to the forensics techs because they needed to collect them as evidence. And he also told the kids to not go anywhere near their mother's bedroom. Candace nodded and stood up and grabbed her little brother by the hand, and as they walked back towards the house, a sheriff's deputy came up to Faust and told the detective that he should also make sure to talk to Bonnie's oldest child. She had a 15-year-old son whose name was Bradley. That evening, Detective Faust paced down the hallway of the Pima County Juvenile Court Center, holding a file folder in his hand. When he opened the door to a small office, a teenage boy was already there waiting, and Faust recognized him from the mugshot in the folder he had as Bradley Sanborn, Bonnie's oldest child. Faust walked in, and as gently as he could, he told Bradley that his mother was missing. And based on the blood and the knife they'd found in her bedroom, she'd likely been viciously attacked, kidnapped, and she could even be dead. So Faust knew that Bradley could not have attacked his mother because he'd been here in the juvenile detention center the whole time the attack took place. But Faust had done some digging on Bradley's friends. He slapped the file folder he was carrying down onto the desk in front of Bradley and began flipping through it, showing Bradley the information he'd found about, in particular, his friend Jason Horbachevsky. Jason was a known gang member, and according to several informants, he was known for carrying a knife around. And sometimes, apparently, he would pull that knife out and stab himself in the side of the head. And so Faust wondered out loud if the knife they'd found in Bonnie's bedroom was Bradley's friend Jason's. And maybe the attack on her was retribution for his mother calling the cops on Jason and Bradley that morning. But when Faust looked at Bradley for his reaction, he saw there were all these tears rolling down his cheeks, and Bradley choked out that he really didn't know anything. And as much as he argued with his mom, he would never hurt her. To Faust, Bradley's reaction actually seemed really genuine, and so he immediately figured that if the gang Jason was a part of, was responsible for whatever happened to Bonnie, Bradley appeared out of the loop. And so to get a better read on this situation, Faust felt like, trying to ask Bradley questions was not going to go very far. Instead, he would just go to Jason and talk to him. Later that same night, Faust sat in the station with a cup of coffee, combing through records on Bradley and also on Jason and Jason's gang. After speaking to Bradley earlier, Faust had immediately tried to locate and interview Jason, which proved to be much more difficult than he'd anticipated. He knew Jason was not in police custody since he'd been released pretty much immediately after the payphone debacle. But Jason also was not at any addresses that he'd been associated with in the past, so it was hard to tell where he even was. So, a few hours ago, Faust had sent out officers to speak to as many members of Jason's gang as possible to see if they knew where he was, and also to see if they knew anything about Bonnie. Now, so far, they had not located Jason, and nobody had brought anything up about Bonnie, but just then, Faust's office door opened, and a deputy told him there was someone he really ought to speak to that was out in the lobby. And so Faust got up, he went in the lobby, and who was waiting for him but none other than Jason. When Faust walked out there, Jason stood up from his chair, acting cocky and confident, and told Faust that he'd heard the sheriff's department was looking for him, and he was there to prove he had nothing to hide. And Faust, he didn't even bother asking where Jason had been. Instead, he just led him into an interrogation room, and when he sat down across from his newest suspect, he noticed the buttons on Jason's shirt. They were small and brown, just like the button that was found on Bonnie's bedroom floor. And also, a few of the buttons on his shirt appeared to be missing. Now, Faust controlled his excitement and didn't show it, and decided pretty much right away that he was not going to ask about the button, at least not at first. He didn't want to overplay his hand. Instead, he started the interview by asking Jason some standard questions about his relationship with Bradley, and also by extension, his relationship with Bonnie, Bradley's mom, and also where Jason was at the time of the attack. And Jason would admit that he was mad about Bonnie calling the police on him and Bradley. But he didn't have some big plan to get revenge. He insisted that he didn't know where Bonnie was or what had happened to her, and he'd been at home asleep on the night she was attacked. And at the end of the interview, he agreed to give Faust a DNA sample, and he even turned over his shirt with the missing brown buttons for forensic analysis. And so after that, Faust released Jason and decided it was time to call it a day.
You know those moments right before you start something new when you're staring at the idea, running through every worst-case scenario and wondering if you're making a huge mistake? That feeling of doubt and uncertainty can be paralyzing. But looking back, making that leap, despite the fear I had, was one of the best decisions I ever made when I started this MrBallen adventure. Because sometimes the scariest step forward is the one that changes everything. Starting something new isn't just hard. It really is terrifying, especially when you're starting a business. But that's why it helps to have such a great partner like Shopify by your side. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses all around the world, from household names like Death Wish Coffee and Magic Spoon to brands just getting started. It's time to turn those what-ifs into sales with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/MrBallen. Go to shopify.com/MrBallen. Again, that's shopify.com/MrBallen.
The next morning, Sunday, December 10th, so a day after Bonnie went missing, Faust sat in his office and sorted through all the information his team had collected the day before. While Faust had interviewed Bradley and Jason, other members of his team had spoken to Bonnie's friends, family, and neighbors. But so far, it looked like nobody knew anything that was helpful. A few neighbors had mentioned that the Sanborns had family problems, but apart from that, they all said Bonnie seemed nice, and they had no idea who would want to hurt her. Faust continued reading, looking for some kind of clue in all the interviews, when his office phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the line sounded terrified, and he said he had a tip in the Bonnie Sanborn case. The man explained that earlier that morning, he'd seen a news report about Bonnie's disappearance and how the detectives were looking for her car, which the police had learned was a light blue Chrysler. And he said that just the day before, he and his wife had actually passed a car just like that on their morning run. It was abandoned on the side of the road in the desert just outside of town. He said at the time, he and his wife had not gotten too close to the car, and they really hadn't thought much of it until they had seen this news report. And so after seeing the report just a few minutes ago, he and his wife had gone back to the desert to see if the car was still there. And he said not only was the car still there, but when they walked up close, they could see in the back seat what appeared to be a woman's body. Faust immediately wrote down the car's location, and when he looked at a map, he realized it was only about a half-mile away from Bonnie's house. He thanked the man, hung up the phone, and then he got in his car and he raced out toward the desert. And when he got past the edge of town into the open desert, he saw right up ahead a light blue Chrysler parked in the sand. He stopped his car on the shoulder near the car, he got out, and he approached the Chrysler, and he peered through the window, and almost immediately, he did see a woman's body. It was Bonnie's body, and she was slumped over in the back seat, just as the man had said. Bonnie's arms were bound behind her back, and there was a sock stuffed in her mouth, and the lower half of her body was naked. And for Faust, in seeing this, he wasn't surprised, but at the same time, he had held out hope that maybe Bonnie was alive. Just seeing her dead in such a horrible way in the back of this car was it was heartbreaking. And so Faust went back to his car, he radioed the station, and he waited until a forensics team arrived. And then at that point, he went back over to the Chrysler, and he began to examine the body. Faust put on gloves, and he leaned into the car, and he lifted up Bonnie's head. And he found there were wounds all over her skull, as if she'd been repeatedly struck in the head with something very sharp. And her partial nudity made it seem likely that she was also sexually assaulted. There were also clear defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, which suggested she had fought back hard against her killer. One of the forensics officers pulled out a blacklight and began running it across the back seat of the car to check for potential DNA evidence. And Faust watched as the forensics officer ran the light over Bonnie's leg, and it lit up a spot. And the officer told Faust that almost definitely that spot was the killer's semen. And so he swabbed the area and put the swab into an evidence bag and told Faust that in a matter of maybe a few weeks, they should get the DNA profile back from the lab and maybe they'd know who their killer was. In the meantime, the fingerprints found in Bonnie's bedroom were analyzed, and they'd come back with a match that really surprised Detective Faust. All the fingerprints and that bloody handprint on the pillow belonged to Bonnie's 13-year-old daughter, Candace. And even though Faust really did not want to consider that a 13-year-old girl had in some way helped with a plot to kill her own mother, he now had to consider it, not only because of the handprint and fingerprints, but also because there was a long record of family problems inside of the Sanborn house. Now, obviously, Candace could not have committed this crime on her own, but she certainly could have helped whoever did. So, Faust confronted Candace, and when he did, she just broke down sobbing. She said she had just been really scared and confused and was just looking in the bedroom for her mom and just didn't realize what she was doing by getting her prints everywhere. And looking at this scared teenager, Faust knew that Candace really didn't make sense as a potential suspect here. But he still felt like Bonnie's killer had to be somebody who knew Bonnie personally and had been in her house before. And there was one person who still had not been ruled out: Bonnie's husband, Robert. Later that day, Faust was sitting at his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. He was on hold and had been for some time, and as he tried to tune out the awful music that was playing on the line, he looked down at the handwritten list of airline names and flight numbers that were on his desk. Bonnie's husband, Robert, had been working in Maryland for the past couple of months, and he had not been scheduled to come back home to Tucson on the weekend his wife was killed. But just because he claimed that he had been in Maryland that whole weekend, didn't mean he actually was. There were multiple flights from Maryland back to Tucson that in theory he could have secretly taken to come home, kill his wife, and then go back to work in time for his next shift. So Faust had compiled a list of every single flight Robert could have theoretically taken, and one by one he was calling the airlines to check the passenger manifests. And so far there hadn't been a Robert Sanborn on any of the flights he had checked, and now he'd made it to the very last flight on that list. And just then, the on-hold music suddenly cut out, and the woman on the line told Faust that she had triple-checked, and there was no Robert Sanborn on that flight either, the one from Maryland to Tucson. And he thanked her, hung up, and sighed. Now, keep in mind, this took place before the events that happened on 9/11. Since 9/11, air travel has been much more rigidly controlled, especially in the United States. I mean, security is so much higher. But pre-9/11, that really wasn't the case. I mean, people didn't even necessarily have to show their ID to get on a domestic flight. And so Faust knew right now, even though he's being told that Robert's name didn't show up on the manifest of any of these flights, it didn't really rule him out because he could have theoretically been traveling under a fake name. But there was a next step that would show if Robert had something to do with this, and that would be to ask Robert for a DNA sample and hope that when the evidence came back from the lab, it would be conclusive enough to give a clear answer. One morning in early January of 1996, so about a month after Bonnie was murdered, Faust answered his office phone and he heard a tech from the crime lab on the other end. In the past few weeks, there had been 5 more murders in the Tucson area that Faust and his team were now dealing with. So when the lab tech said he had results in the Bonnie Sanborn case, it actually took Faust a few seconds to remember which murder that was for. But once he remembered, he quickly sat down at his desk and he grabbed a pen to take notes. And he held his breath as the lab tech told him that they had tested the sample found on Bonnie's leg, and it was not a match for her husband Robert, nor was it a match for her son's friend, Jason Horbachevsky. Those brown buttons on Jason's shirt also didn't come back as matching the button that was found in Bonnie's bedroom, so it really was just a coincidence that they looked alike to the naked eye. Faust was disappointed, but he knew this was going to be a possibility, and he had a backup plan. He asked the lab tech to run the DNA sample against the DNA of every sex offender on the state registry to see if there was a match there. But as the crime lab slowly began doing that, they kept calling Faust to update him that they had not found a match yet. And eventually, the search for a DNA match ultimately just stalled, and Faust was pulled onto other cases. And so by that summer, it was looking like Bonnie's murder case might go cold. Then, after 9 months without any progress, an anonymous tip came in. That summer, in September of 1996, Detective Faust sat inside of an interrogation room at the sheriff's department across from a 40-year-old drug dealer named Lyle Winstead. The anonymous tipster had said that Lyle had sold drugs to several people in Bonnie's neighborhood, and he'd said some things about the case that the tipster thought were very concerning. And when Faust had dug through Lyle's records, he'd found that Lyle had a history of violent crimes involving knives. Sitting inside the interrogation room, Lyle seemed obviously nervous and very jumpy, and when Faust started asking him questions about Bonnie's murder, Lyle made excuses for the killer, saying that maybe the killer wasn't such a bad guy. Maybe he was just, quote, on a bad trip. Now, Faust thought this was incredibly suspicious to be talking that way, so he asked Lyle for a DNA sample. And he got one, and he sent it off to the crime lab. And Faust had to wait several weeks for the results, and when they finally came in, Lyle Winstead was not a match. And at that point, Faust was feeling really frustrated. I mean, they'd already put in so much work with really nothing to show for it, and he didn't want the momentum on the case to die again. So before he put Bonnie's file back on the shelf, he decided to go back to square one and make sure there wasn't anything he just plain missed. The next month, between all the other cases he was working on, Faust found time to go literally door to door through Bonnie's neighborhood and re-interview everybody his team had already spoken to almost a year ago. Faust knew how gossip spread in quiet communities like this one, and even though nobody had been able to offer any leads the first time around, he wondered if maybe anything unusual might have surfaced since then. So he knocked on one door after another, and eventually, at a house down the street, a woman told him that she didn't know anything personally, but there was a rumor circulating around the neighborhood that he might want to look into. So Faust did. And after so many frustrating dead ends to this point, it was ultimately this rumor that did allow him to solve the case. Based on that rumor, and also DNA and other evidence that was later uncovered, this is what police believe happened to Bonnie Sanborn on December 9th, 1995. Around 2:30 in the morning, Bonnie's killer watched her house from a hiding spot where nobody could see them. The killer knew the Sanborns had been trying to move to Maryland, but the killer felt like before they did go to Maryland, if they did that, there was something the killer had to do. Around 3 a.m., as the killer was watching the house, they saw the light in Bonnie's living room finally go dark. And then the killer saw some movement behind the curtains in one of the bedroom windows, and then that lamp went out, leaving the entire house completely dark. The killer had intentionally waited for this moment. They wanted to make sure that not just Bonnie, but her children were asleep by the time they went inside. And so now that the lights were off and that it seemed like the coast was clear, the killer grabbed their flex ties and also their chipping hammer, and then began making their way towards the home. A chipping hammer is a very particular type of hammer that has a sort of typical one side that you would use to strike something, but the back of that hammer is sharp, almost like a pickaxe. And so with this barbaric tool they were about to use in hand, they slowly crept their way across Bonnie's backyard, right up to the sliding glass door at the back of the house. And they found it was unlocked, just like they thought it would be. After all, they'd been to this house before, they sort of understood this one typically stayed unlocked, and they also knew what was on the other side of this door. It was Bonnie's bedroom. After sliding open the door, the killer stepped in, and they found Bonnie, asleep under the covers in her bed. And so thinking here was their chance, the killer began moving towards the bed. But as they stepped closer, a floorboard creaked, and Bonnie stirred awake. And she rolled over and looked in the direction of the creaking sound and made eye contact with the killer, and the killer knew they had to strike. Bonnie tried to fight back, but it was no use. The killer completely overpowered her. Once Bonnie stopped struggling, but before she stopped breathing, the killer used those flex ties to bind her hands behind her back. Then, as she was laying there, unable to defend herself, they searched around for her purse. And when they found it, they dumped it out on the bed. And after they had emptied it, they found her car keys. And so they grabbed the keys, and then the killer picked up Bonnie, still very much alive, and they carried her out that sliding door into the backyard and then out into the garage. There, they used her car keys to unlock Bonnie's car, the blue Chrysler, and they put Bonnie in the back seat. Then they hopped in the driver's seat and they drove the car out into the desert, where they parked on the side of the road. When the killer was done with Bonnie, they simply got out of the car and left it where it was and walked back into town. And as the sun began to rise, the killer wandered right back down Bonnie Street in the direction of the Sanborn house. It would turn out Detective Faust had been so focused on finding the killer amongst Bonnie's immediate family and friends that he really hadn't even considered somebody else who was literally physically closest to the Sanborns, her across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old Freddie Royval. Now, Freddie was not actually, emotionally close with the Sanborns, but he and his dad had, in the past, gone out of their way to help Bonnie, by doing some repair work at her house. But what Faust had learned when he had gone back and re-interviewed all the people on the street to see if he had missed something, one of the other neighbors, who was not remotely involved in what happened to Bonnie, told Faust that there was actually a rumor that Freddie had found Bonnie attractive. And there was also another rumor floating around that Faust learned that previously a woman had been assaulted by a younger man in this neighborhood and that maybe it was Freddie. Now, it's unknown if Freddie actually was the subject of that second rumor, but it was enough for Faust and the police to go collect DNA samples from every young man on the block, and wouldn't you know it, Freddie's DNA came back as a match. Freddie Royval was arrested in January of 1997, a little over a year after Bonnie's murder. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice fresh donut. But don't tell them the powdered sugar on the donut is actually just baby powder. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in July of 1997, a man named Abdel Sadr Bedawi laid in a hospital bed in El Menouphia, Egypt, which is northwest of Cairo. And he felt horrible, but this was nothing new. So Bedawi was in his 60s, and unfortunately, he spent a lot of time in hospitals because he had chronic liver disease. It made him feel weak and tired and caused him to get really bloated and vomit pretty often. But recently, Bedawi had begun experiencing some new and even more concerning symptoms. Most recently, he'd come into the hospital because he was feeling really clumsy and disoriented. It seemed like his liver disease was getting so advanced that he was now experiencing symptoms in his brain as well. So that morning, Bedawi was on a whole bunch of medications to try to treat his liver disease, but so far, it felt like the medication really wasn't doing much of anything. He still had all the symptoms he had come in with. And so feeling really disheartened, he's just laying in his bed. There's nobody else in his hospital room. And so he's just trying to get through it minute by minute. And as he's laying there, he starts to feel really lightheaded, like way more lightheaded than he had felt at all at any point while he was at the hospital. And it was so extreme, so fast that he was gonna call out for a nurse, but it was like he couldn't even make a sound. It was like his body was shutting down. And then it was like everything went black. At some point later, could have been minutes later, hours later, days later, Bedawi had no idea, but he had the sensation of waking up. Except when he opened his eyes, everything was still totally black, like he can't see anything. But in this kind of weird sensation of coming back to reality, he quickly was able to sort of feel that he still had all his limbs. He could feel his whole body lying flat on some surface, which could have been the bed he was still on. He didn't know. But he's thinking to himself, I'm alive. I can tell I'm alive. I can't see. I don't know where I am. I don't know what happened to me, but I'm still alive. But when he tried to move, it was like he felt trapped. It's like he couldn't quite tell if he was literally physically being confined in some space or if he was paralyzed. He didn't know. He just couldn't move. And so suddenly he has this wave of claustrophobia come over him that he needs to escape, and he starts screaming out for help. And eventually somebody heard him. It would turn out 12 hours earlier, when Bedoui was laying in his bed and he could still see, and he suddenly had this extreme lightheadedness come over him, and then it all went black for the first time. Well, what was actually happening is he was going into a very deep coma. It was because of his liver disease and other ailments he had, but he goes into this really deep coma. The hospital he was at, they didn't recognize it as a coma. They thought Bedoui had actually died. And so they put him in a coffin and they put him in the refrigerator. And that's where he was when he woke up hours later. He was literally in a coffin. And the reason he couldn't move is because he was in a coffin and was physically restricted in that space. And so he starts screaming out. He's totally claustrophobic. And there were employees that actually just happened to be near the door of the walk-in fridge where all the other coffins and bodies were. And they heard him. They walked inside and they saw one of the bodies is literally sitting up in their coffin. And so when Bedoui realized what had happened here, he jumped out of the coffin and ran out of the room, vowing to never come back to the hospital. But that's not the end of the story. One of the hospital employees who went into the fridge and saw Bedoui sitting up in his coffin, basically was one of the people who freed Bedoui. They were so shocked by what they saw. Remember, they don't know that he was still alive. They think they've walked into the fridge and a dead person is sitting up like a zombie and is now like talking to them and running out of the room. That was so terrifying for them that they literally had a heart attack and died. And where were they placed after they were dead? In Bedoui's literal coffin. Early one morning in January of 1955, 25-year-old Carl Gilbert struggled to stay awake as he drove down a dark highway in rural Kansas. Carl had been driving since about 3 in the morning because he was on his way to an early morning meeting at a college that was over 200 miles away. He didn't want to be late. And so Carl, he took another sip of his coffee and rubbed his face to try and wake himself up, but his eyelids were so heavy and he really was struggling to focus on the road. So Carl was a recruiter. And so it was his job to drive around to different universities in Kansas and Oklahoma to try and recruit graduating seniors for his company. So as a result of that, he was used to waking up in the middle of the night and driving these long distances to get to these colleges. But despite this being sort of typical behavior for him, today he just felt like he was way more tired than normal. And so Carl yawned and drank some more coffee, and he could just feel his eyes getting heavier and heavier. And then at some point, he closed his eyes for what he wanted to be just for like a second, but it just felt like he couldn't quite open them again. And as he's sort of like blinking for this really long extended blink, he hears a voice in the car. He's all alone in his car. It's the middle of the night. He's by himself, but he hears a voice right behind him actually yell into his ear, "Guy, look out!" Carl, after hearing the voice, jolted upright. He opened his eyes and he realized he hadn't just blinked. He had fallen asleep at the wheel and was now speeding toward a concrete marker on the side of the highway. And so he grabbed the steering wheel and he yanked it just in time so that he only sideswiped the marker instead of a head-on collision, which almost certainly would have killed him. And so Carl, he jammed on the brakes and his car came to a screeching stop on the side of the road. And there, Carl just, he sat there just taking stock of how close he had just come to dying. His whole body was shaking, like he couldn't believe that had just happened. But eventually, he was able to calm down enough to get out of his car and assess the damage, because he did sideswipe that concrete marker. And when he got out and looked, he saw the damage was actually kind of bad. There was 2 flat tires and the whole side of his car was totally smashed up and scraped. But ultimately, Carl really didn't care. He genuinely felt thankful to be alive. Later that morning, Carl sat at a diner just a few miles down the road, eating some breakfast and reading the morning paper. A passing car had pulled over and helped him patch up his own car just enough to drive to the meeting and then also drive to this diner to get something to eat. Carl still felt very rattled from nearly getting into a very likely fatal car accident. But even more than just the fact that he nearly died, is Carl now was thinking a lot about that voice that had yelled in his ear and had woken him up and essentially saved him from smashing into the concrete marker. But what really stood out to him was that this voice had not called him Carl. It didn't say, "Carl, wake up." The voice had said, "Guy, watch out." Guy called him Guy, and Guy was not his name. But Carl actually had a childhood friend named Peter who called him Guy as a nickname. He was like the only person who called Carl Guy. And as Carl thought about this voice, he started to think that the sound of the voice really sounded an awful lot like Peter. And so it sounds like Peter, and they're calling me Guy? Like, was that Peter talking to me? Like, that didn't make any sense. Now, keep in mind, what Carl is actually thinking is like his subconscious has like channeled a voice to save himself. He's not literally thinking that, his friend Peter is sitting in the back seat telling him to watch out, but he's just thinking to himself, Carl is, why wouldn't it be like my mom or like, a relative, coming in and saving my life if it's my subconscious doing it? Why Peter? Like, Peter was so random if that's what it was. Carl and Peter had kind of drifted apart as they grew up. I mean, they were still in touch, but Carl lived in Kansas and Peter was in the military serving at a naval air base in Texas. Like, there was no special reason why Carl would hear Peter's voice instead of somebody else. It felt like a completely random thing. Eventually, Carl's thinking that it just must have been my brain firing off in this panicked moment trying to save my life, and for one reason or another, it came through as like Peter's voice calling me Guy, whatever. And so ultimately, Carl just went back to eating his breakfast and reading the newspaper. But when he flipped the page over and looked at the headline of the next page, he froze. The news story was actually about Carl's childhood friend, Peter. Peter had just died in this horrific military training accident. Specifically, he had died in a crash just hours before Carl heard the sound of some man's voice saying, "Guy, look out." The only person that ever called Carl Guy was Peter. And so Carl could never explain how or why any of this happened. But what he always believed is that in death, his friend Peter saved his life. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Heaviness in your life doesn't usually announce itself. Typically, it just sort of hits you. For example, when I left the military and had to reintegrate back into civilian life, that meant I was leaving behind a clear mission, I was leaving behind tight-knit bonds, and an identity that was built on service and purpose, while I was also trying to find my place in a world that felt very unfamiliar. And so this made me carry this really deep emotional weight that I was not expecting. Now, at the time, I kind of told myself that feeling, that heaviness inside of me, that it would just sort of pass with time. Once I get situated as a civilian, it'll just go away. But it didn't. And eventually, I began to wonder, why am I still struggling with this? Why do I still feel this really intense weight on me? Well, the reason for that is emotional weight does not just disappear because your life moves on. It stays with you unless you deal with it. That heaviness, it's not like a symbol of a failure in your life. In reality, it's just your brain holding on to what at one point was keeping you safe. Now, if you're feeling this way, having some awareness around this definitely helps. But untangling it, getting this weight sort of off your shoulders, often requires someone trained to help you let it go. The new year is not about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about finding support that helps you feel lighter moving forward. A great starting point for anybody who thinks they could use this type of service is BetterHelp.
With over 30,000 licensed therapists, you'll have access to a diverse community of professionals across different specialties, backgrounds, and locations. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month and take a step toward feeling lighter in 2026.
On the evening of December 12, 1966, a 44-year-old man named Jose Lorente knocked on the front door of an apartment in the Bronx, which is a neighborhood in New York City. The door opened up just a crack, and Jose saw this woman inside who was eyeing him kind of reluctantly. And then when she saw, who he was and what he was carrying, she kind of, opened the door just wide enough that Jose, and also the large bag he was carrying, could fit and come inside. Once Jose was inside, the woman immediately shut and bolted the door shut behind him. Then she led Jose into the living room, where her son, a 24-year-old man named Ivan Barbosa, was already sitting on the couch. Ivan looked like a guy who had not slept in weeks. And Jose, based on the story he had been told, could understand why. So Jose had a day job as a tailor, but he also had a second and much more unique job. He was a self-proclaimed psychic medium, and he conducted spiritual cleansings for people who believed they were being haunted, like Ivan. But Jose did not actually believe in ghosts. He was firmly a skeptic. Now, he marketed himself as a psychic medium, but he knew that the cleansings that he performed were not really supernatural. They were psychological. In his experience, if somebody believed they were being haunted, they were actually just suffering from something more mundane, like depression or grief or loneliness. And so when Jose would perform his cleansing ceremonies for these people, like he was about to do for Ivan, he would go in and act very convincing, like he believed what he was doing was truly supernatural. But what he knew he was actually doing was just kind of giving these people a placebo pill. He saw that after these ceremonies, the haunted people, they would feel much better. They believed that the haunting was gone, that they were free now. And in many cases, they would get much better. And so Jose, he knew he was misleading these people, but he felt like, the ends justified the means. And so on this day, Jose was here at this apartment to do one of these ceremonies for Ivan, because Ivan's mother had called Jose earlier that day and said that, Ivan was being haunted by the ghost of this old woman, and he wasn't sleeping, and he was a wreck, and they just really needed his help, and they had heard Jose was somebody who could help. So Jose sat down across from Ivan and just did what he always did. He spoke to Ivan and said, "Okay, tell me about the haunting." Ivan seemed really, really nervous, but once he sort of calmed down enough to talk, he sort of stammered out that there was this ghost, this old woman, who would appear in his room basically every night, and she had been for months. But he said, this woman's expression, it seemed like every night she would get angrier, and it was just horrifying, to the point where Ivan, he was terrified to go to his room to sleep at night. And so basically he wasn't sleeping. He was just terrified all the time of this ghost. Jose nodded along very sympathetically, even though, secretly he did not believe Ivan was literally being haunted. But what he did believe is that Ivan did believe he was being haunted. And that's what mattered. That's really what he was here to fix. So eventually, after Ivan was done talking, Jose told him that he knew exactly how to help him. He explained that they were going to perform a seance so they could contact this old woman's spirit and basically ask her to leave Ivan alone. Ivan looked very doubtful, but Jose reassured him that he had done this many times before and usually this works. And so Ivan ultimately said, "Okay, let's do it." So Jose reached over and he opened up his large bag he had brought, and he began taking out the supplies that he had brought along for this seance. The first thing he did is he pulled out these big black sheets and he put them over the TV and the radio, because in his experience, this was a good sort of overt way to symbolically shut out the outside world. And then after that, he placed a bunch of small candles in a big circle basically around the living room. And in the center of the circle, in the middle of the living room, was a coffee table. And he placed this really old-looking Bible on the coffee table. And then he also put some incense on the table next to the Bible. And then he lit all the candles in the room, and he lit the incense. Finally, Jose shut all the blinds in the apartment to make sure the room was as dark as possible. And then he asked Ivan and his mother to come over and sit within the circle of candles, basically on the floor in the middle of the living room, right near the coffee table. And so once all of them were sitting down, basically in a mini circle of their own, Jose began by grabbing that old Bible and reading a prayer out of it. And then afterwards, he closed the Bible, put it back on the table, and then he told Ivan and also Ivan's mom to go ahead and hold hands. All three of them were going to hold hands. And then once they were holding hands, Jose took a deep breath and told them all to close their eyes. And then once they had, he did what he always did at these seances. He spoke in a very calm, clear voice and asked any spirits in the room to please give a sign that they could hear him. Now, typically Jose would, wait to hear some natural sound in the building, like the sound of the building settling, or maybe a gust of wind to rattle the windows, or any sound, basically, that he could then attribute to a spirit in the room. And then if for some reason some natural sound didn't occur once, the people's eyes were closed, Jose would sometimes tap his foot while everybody else wasn't looking. And he would say, oh, that's the spirit, that's the ghost making contact with us. And so for a minute or so, Jose was totally quiet, holding their hands, their eyes are closed, and he's just listening for any sounds that he could use. And when none came, he was about to tap his foot and sort of initiate the seance that way. But then something happened that Jose had never experienced before. It felt like his entire body suddenly got shocked by like an electric current. His body went rigid and he couldn't move, and then his vision just went completely black. Then there was like this series of bright, confusing images that flashed through his mind. He saw a cup of hot chocolate rattling on a table. He saw a bedsheet being torn by these dirty hands. He saw an open eye, a screaming mouth, a flash of red, then silver, then red again. The images cycled over and over in his mind so quickly they kind of became a blur. And suddenly Jose felt himself open his mouth and he wanted to scream out for help. But instead, he heard himself speak. But the voice that came out was not his own. It was like this high-pitched, gravelly shriek that almost seemed like it was coming through Jose from another world. There was a rhythm to it, maybe words, but everything was happening so fast, and the images were still cycling through his mind, he couldn't make sense of anything. But then just as quickly as all of this had begun, the voice that was coming through him stopped, Jose's mind went completely blank, and his body went limp. And he sort of slowly came to, and he found himself lying on the floor, feeling completely disoriented. For a second, he didn't even know where he was, but then he kind of came to, and he realized he was in the living room of this apartment. He saw all the candles in the circle. He remembered he had come here to do this seance, but clearly something had gone wrong. And now also he found his body was sore and his throat felt raw. Like, what just happened? He didn't even know. Now, as Jose is sort of coming to and realizing like, okay, I'm back to reality, the first thought he had as he processed whatever that was that he must have had some kind of seizure and that he now very likely needed medical attention. But as he began to look around the room and really take stock of his surroundings, he noticed three things. 1, the front door of the apartment was wide open. 2, Ivan's mother was staring at him with this completely horrified expression, like Jose was possessed. And 3, Ivan was gone. Jose asked Ivan's mom, like, what happened? Where's Ivan? What's going on? And what she told him completely contradicted everything Jose thought he believed about ghosts and about seances. According to Ivan's mom, during the seance, Jose had at some point entered some kind of a trance. At first, his body had gone sort of rigid, then his eyes rolled back in his head, and then he kind of sat upright and looked right at Ivan. And as he did, he began speaking in this shrill, gravelly voice that almost sounded like an old woman. She told Jose it really sounded like it was the ghost that apparently had been haunting her son, like she had taken over Jose's body. And then, this ghost, apparently speaking through Jose, had said something to Ivan that was so horrifying, Ivan had literally jumped up and sprinted out the door. Now, Jose, he's hearing this and he can't believe what she's saying, but he's also thinking like, this woman has already convinced herself her son is being haunted by a ghost. She's just confirming whatever's happened here must have to do with the ghost. Like, none of what she's just said could have happened. Like, that is absolutely not possible. I clearly just had some sort of medical emergency. Like, I did not get possessed by a ghost. Even though somewhere in the back of Jose's mind, he doesn't know what's happened to him. He can't make sense of what's happened, but he's telling himself, there is a logical explanation for this. It can't be ghosts. But at the same time, Jose also felt kind of bad because clearly, this medical event that he believes he's gone through had frightened Ivan so badly, who was already very mentally fragile, that he's fled off somewhere. And, now who knows what he's doing, but at this point, Jose just felt like this whole thing had gone completely off the rails. He didn't want to be here anymore. He wanted to stop pretending to be a psychic medium. And so he just stood up, he gathered his things, he apologized to Ivan's mother, who was telling him, please stay, like, we got to figure out what's going on here. But he said, I can't. I have to go. I'm sure Ivan will turn up soon. I'm sorry, best of luck to you. And then Jose walked out the door and went home. Now, after Jose got home, he wasn't thinking that Ivan was in any real peril. He just felt like, Ivan got spooked and he will come back eventually. Like, there's no real risk here. They're dealing with some sort of mental breakdown. They're not really being haunted. He'll be back. Everything's fine. But Ivan didn't come back home. And after enough time passed, his mother called the police and they began looking for him. And eventually they would find Ivan. He was in a hotel room one town over and he was dead from an obviously self-inflicted gunshot wound. Now, at first, the police just decided, okay, this is a classic case of a guy who has taken his own life, and that was really all there was to it. But Ivan's mother, when she heard that, she was adamant that they were wrong. There was more to this story. And she began telling the police over and over again that you have to talk to Jose. Because right before my son bolted and took his own life, we had this seance with Jose, a psychic medium, and Jose, he said something to my son that has to be part of the reason he ultimately died. Now, before I tell you what we believe happened to Ivan, we need to step back and sort of understand who he believed was haunting him. Because he didn't just believe some random woman, some old woman was haunting him. He believed the person haunting him was this woman named Elsie Litt, who had actually lived in his neighborhood, but had been murdered 9 months before that seance where he fled and then ultimately died in the hotel room. And her murder was unsolved. And so for Ivan, it was incredibly threatening to be seeing this woman who has been murdered, and we don't know who's killed her, coming into his room at night, looking angrier and angrier. Ivan felt threatened by her. He felt genuinely terrified that this woman is like out for vengeance and he's sort of in her crosshairs. In essence, Ivan felt like he was sort of being blamed for this woman's murder, and she was here to sort of exact her revenge effectively on him. And so it was driving him crazy. He's terrified all the time. And so here comes Jose to have this seance. And what happens in the middle of this seance when Jose basically goes into this weird, seizure/possession is after he went into the state and he's kind of rigid for a second, his eyes are back in his head, he suddenly sits up and he looks right at Ivan and he says in that shrill, womanly voice, "You killed me and you're going to die the same way." And then he snapped out of the trance, doesn't remember any of it. But Ivan, he took this as like confirmation that she was after him. This ghost was targeting him and he was so scared, he literally just ran away. But ultimately, the ghost, persisted in his life. He lost his mind and ultimately took his life in the hotel room. And so Ivan's mother is like adamantly telling the police, you gotta talk to Jose because he told my son, you killed me and you're gonna die the same way. And it sent him off running and now he's dead. And so the police, they're like, okay, I don't believe any of this. I don't believe that this seance was actually supernatural. I don't know what's going on here, but none of this makes any sense. However, Ivan's mother was so persistent that they would finally go and talk to Jose. And when police spoke to Jose and they asked him about the seance, he was like, oh my goodness, yeah, I did the seance. I don't believe in any of this stuff. And I don't know what happened. I think I had like a seizure or something. I don't even know what I was saying. I don't remember any of it. All I know is that, during the time that presumably I was possessed, I was just seeing these weird visions. That's really all I remember. And so the police asked him, like, well, what visions did you see? Humor us. And so Jose, he began to think about what he saw. He actually remembered really specifically a few images that stood out to him the most. And he said, I saw this torn bed sheet that was being manipulated with these dirty hands. I saw a silver sliver, like a knife or something. And I saw a cup of hot chocolate kind of rattling on a table. But to be honest, I just think I was having a medical emergency. I don't really know what it was. And I came to, and Ivan's mom's convinced I was possessed by this woman. I have no idea what's going on. I gotta be honest, I don't have any memory of speaking to Ivan. I have no idea what happened here. Now, Jose really didn't think anything he was saying was particularly important. He thought what he was saying was kind of nonsensical, and the police would certainly not follow up on any of this. But the police, after he said, what he saw in his mind's eye, they said, tell us again what you saw, in this blackout you had. And so again, Jose went over it, talking about the bed sheet, the silver knife or whatever he saw, and the hot chocolate. And the police were astonished because it would turn out Elsie Litt, who had been murdered 9 months earlier, she had been strangled by a dirty bed sheet that had been wrapped around her neck. There had been a cup of hot chocolate on the bedside table where she was found, and she had been stabbed repeatedly with a silver knife. Those details were not public. Nobody knew those details, and Jose certainly had no reason to know those details, but here he is, potentially being possessed by the ghost of Elsie Litt, seeing images effectively of the crime scene. It was just too much. And so the police ultimately, based on the hallucinations that Jose had during the seance, did some digging into Ivan to see if maybe there's a reason Ivan's being targeted by this ghost. And it would turn out Ivan was the killer. He murdered Elsie Litt. And apparently her ghost came back to serve him justice. Police would officially close the Elsie murder investigation and would name Ivan as her killer. As for Jose, he could never explain what actually happened during that seance. But because of his experience, he never dabbled in the spirit world again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.